Welcome, everyone, to the 10th episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, the podcast on all things forecasting and geopolitics. My name is Clay Graubard, and I'm joined with my co-host, Andrew Eady. This is a special episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast because Andrew is not in his home state of New York this week. He is over down in Miami, Florida. Andrew, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I go home today, so I'm very sad to leave. The nice weather, nice people, but it's been a nice day, a nice little escape from New York City. But I'm ready to go back.
That's great. And today it's just the two of us before you hop on your flight here. I think in just an hour and a half, 2 hours. So this is a very special episode. We're going to be
That's
covering
right.
three main topics today. We're going to be going over our recent forecast about the war in Donbass. We're going to go over a few papers that we've been reading in forecasting recently, most notably the bias, information, and noise paper that came out recently. And then we're also going to be talking about our upcoming forecast on the election in Peru. But before that, we want to sort of make a little PSA to all of our listeners that next week on this podcast, we will be sitting down with Gaia, the CEO of Metaculus. And so if you guys have any questions for Gaia for the rapid fire section of our podcast that we do, put it in the comments section if you're on YouTube, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. You can reach out to us on our Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn pages, all under Global Guessing, and put your questions on the post sharing this podcast episode, and it just might be asked to Gaia in next week's episode. So without further ado, let us hop into our first topic, which is the war in Donbass and our forecast there. So, Andrew, why don't you give us a little bit of a background on that?
Sure. So for those of you who have been keeping up with the global guessing articles coming out, last week we released our first forecast about the conflict in the Donbass. We broke it out into both positive and negative signals for conflict. The positive signals included, but not limited to, just the cost of moving all of the artillery and troops, the fact that Biden is still sort of early on in the new administration, and the fact that Russia might want to test him, and America more generally. The idea that if there's so much buildup on both sides, the chances of an accidental spark, something happening that would lead to escalated conflict would be really high. Those are a few of the positive signals. And the negative signals included a lot of the analysis by our friend of the podcast, former Eurasia Group employee, Aaron Schwartzbaum, who was basically saying that, I mean, you have to read the article to find out, but he said, the fact that a lot of Russia's military movements were public, the fact there was not really any geopolitical impetus for Russia to annex more of Ukraine or to really start conflict there. He felt like conflict was not very possible. We ended up having our first prediction was 51% likelihood that that there would be conflict,
And
specifically
what do we
250.
mean by conflict? Yeah.
Right. So the meticulous question you were answering, the criteria was, would there be 250 or more deaths in any given month before the end of 2021 between these two countries? And like I said, Aaron thought chances were low. We had a 51% chance. Recently, however, news was released that Russia was withdrawing their troops from the border. There was word from the foreign minister that they felt like their exercise was successful, that they felt like they were ready to move back. And so we actually dropped that initial forecast from 51% down to 15%. Clay, however, recently brought up to me the fact that for a lot of reasons, including the fact that this same sort of movement withdrawal happened in 2014, but there was still annexation. We were reconsidering how significantly we dropped that forecast. 51 to 15 might have been a bit too high, especially given the fact that the withdrawal news was supposed to be for May 1st. At the time of recording, it's April 25th. So there's still time for that to, not be the case, like to not pan out. And so, we may end up revising that 15% to go a bit higher, just given the fact that there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the recasting, which is what we consider changing a forecast more than 5% in either direction, because that makes a sort of a meaningful jump in sort of buckets of probabilities. Um, that we may have went too far. As we talked about in our piece, we calculated, I think, a base rate that between now and October was about 25% likelihood of these deaths being reached, and we sort of
Right.
really sort of chopped down our number based on. I think what for me the biggest issue was is it was on the announcement of troop withdrawal. Um, in a similar way that we did our Suez Canal forecast, which it was a lot about the news of they're gonna be airlifting cargo containers off of the ship, if
Mhm.
the ship doesn't get undone. I think we may have made a similar over reliance on announcements of things when it came to this forecast, which was sort of one of my concerns. The other one, which, yeah, you brought up, which I had no idea of, is that in 2014, before Russia annexed Ukraine, they'd amassed troops, and then they announced that the troops were going to be leaving the border, and they were leaving the border um, when sort of a lot of the conflict broke out, which I didn't know. I think that came out from the Twitter list that I created to get insight on this forecasting question, which, if you guys follow us on Twitter at Global Guessing, you guys can access this list. I believe it's public. Um, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you're seeing it on my screen. Um, but yeah, we have a list here on Twitter where we've been sort of following people in the open source intelligence community, and sort of people that follow Russian action and Eastern Europe politics and geopolitics quite closely to try to get not only better signals but sort of discover those signals for the forecast in advance. I think the other point that I'm not entirely sure how I feel about, and I'd love to get your perspective, is the fact that they've announced that they're moving the troops away, but a lot of the machinery and the sort of the heavy transport stuff, the munitions, the vehicles, all of that, a large portion of that is staying in uh, Western Russia by the border of Ukraine, which means that if they wanted to sort of rebuild up a massive troop presence, all they had to do was send the people back, and a lot of the sort of the physical machinery of war is still there. I don't know how we take that in terms of evaluating the whole situation, but I think my initial perspective is that we sort of overestimated the amount of the we overestimated how much tensions have cooled relative to the fact that since the start of this year tensions have been up. Right. For those of you who aren't aware, the war in Donbass situation really sort of picked up it started in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea. There's been fighting both in Crimea and in the Donbass region. It simmered down in about 2015 and has sort of stayed at a pretty muted level, at least internationally, um, since then. But tensions have been picking up substantially since the start of this year, and then the troop buildup happened. And so now we're at the point where the troop buildup is announced to be going down, should be done by May 1st. We'll see. But then we still have a situation where deaths are up on the Ukrainian military side relative to the past. Geopolitical tensions in the region don't seem to have been down, and you still have all that machinery. So maybe we're actually supposed to still be at a point above the base rate. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think your analysis is spot on. I think, when you leave tanks, when you leave artillery, you leave infrastructure, obviously you can build back up more quickly than you did the first time. They've been building up for a while now. I think even you said it was started in January. So I think initially it might have taken a couple months, but now I feel like Russia could build back up maybe in a week, 2 weeks if they need to just get troops out there. And I think that just speaks to the fact that, yeah, there's still so many question marks um, about what Russia's intentions are, about what's going to happen between Russia and Ukraine in the next month, 2 months by the end of the year. And I think 15%, given the fact that they could build back up so quickly, given the fact there's so many question marks, is probably a bit too low. Um, it's probably a bit too low. And for those who aren't aware, I wasn't aware of this, so I think it's interesting for other people to hear. There's a lot of deception that goes on in warfare, especially with Russia. Clay sent me a video recently of Russia inflating fake artillery to confuse the West and make them, I get, I guess, to make them think that buildup was happening at a faster pace or that it was accelerated or something.
We should say
Um,
allegedly because it was posted by the Sun, which is
okay, allegedly, yeah, the son of the terrible. Okay, that's a great point. But just the idea that there's so many question marks as to what's actually going on the ground, as well as intentions. I think we'll probably revise the forecast, and we're going to be keeping up to date with what's going on in the region. But but yeah, I think we're going to have to raise it from 15, 100%. And I think that what you're saying before about the fact that they left a lot of their artillery there and removed the troops was probably an effort to sort of de-escalate the conflict a bit and say, listen, we're taking a step to ameliorate Ukraine, but Ukraine ought to watch out because if they continue to build up, if they continue to be aggressive, we can be back very quickly, and it may not be as friendly the next time around.
yeah. I think actually part of understanding where this percentage is supposed to be is answering the question that was asked to us on Twitter by Peter Herford, who's an elite forecaster on Metaculus. We had him on the right side of maybe the inaugural episode talking about the Suez Canal forecast, where he was way better at processing that information than we were. And he asked us on Twitter, do we know anything about why they, in this case Russia, massed so many troops on the border and why they pulled back? Was it just to be threatening? And I think I still don't feel like I confidently fully understand the rationale of it. I did some reading in the Moscow Times, which is in more independent news source about what's happening in Russia, as well as reading some Russian propaganda. I got some advice from a good friend of mine who um, is at Oxford. He is Russian himself. Uh, he has done some work for the Kremlin with regards to foreign policy in the past. So he knows this area, and he recommended that uh, to sort of understand in some ways what the Russian aims and perspective was to actually read Russian propaganda um, on this matter. And it seems like some of it, taking both from the Moscow Times article and propaganda, was one way to view this would be to get um, attention from the West in an administration that has taken the perspective that it's just best to sort of ignore Russia. It is in part sanctions, it's in part rhetoric, but the sort of the guiding perspective of the Biden administration is in some ways to ignore Russia when possible, and that this was in some ways Russia forcing attention onto itself and to um, raise like a pay attention to us. And in some ways the Russians got that because they were promoting the fact that Biden was the one that reached out to form a summit, although at the same time Biden is then sort of taken off the I'll be there for a summit if Putin wants to, which is sort of what Russia wanted to avoid, was this whole like Biden will do what he's going to do, and so Russia can either play along or be ignored, which could then be a signal that this might happen more so. But it could be part of that. It could be part of reframing what's happening in Donbass right now. It's Putin got in some ways credit for not invading further into Donbass and not doing more, which is, I think, a sort of a positive shift in terms of framing of the conflict for his position, which could be advantageous. I don't know. What are you thinking in terms of what could have been the Kremlin's motivations, both for bringing the troops there and for taking them away from the border?
I think we're trying to decipher what Russia's intentions are. I think Ukraine's trying to decipher what Russia's intentions are. I think that's sort of the beauty and the downfall of geopolitics, is the fact that there's asymmetric information we don't know, and that's what I think contributes to some of the tension in the regions. The fact that we don't know what certain countries want out of this conflict. Um, I think you're right. I think a lot of it's probably posturing. I think a lot of it is what Aaron had shared with us. Is that there wasn't any geopolitical impetus for any conflict. My guess is that Putin did not really want to go into Ukraine, start a more escalated conflict. But now he's going to get a pat on the back for not doing that. So it's sort of a win-win for him, I think. So in a lot of ways, as you're saying, the PR angle is a big one. Um, but I think also, Ukraine has been a bit louder about wanting to join NATO recently. I think, this has been sort of a trend that's been persisting for a long time, the last 2 decades in the region, more of Eastern Europe joining NATO. And so I think, Putin at some point will want to put a foot down right at Russia's doorstep and say, listen, Hungary, Northern Macedonia, all these other countries can join NATO, but Ukraine is going to be precluded from that. And so I think, maybe this artillery that he's leaving at the border um, is not really an act of aggression so much as it is just like the new normal. This is what's going to have to be here to make sure that we can maintain the status quo of Ukraine being um, staying outside of NATO and being a quote unquote friend to Russia. Um, and Zelensky's obviously been very vocal um, against Russia, pro NATO. I don't know if he's going to be willing to just go along with that sort of narrative, but I think this may be a new normal for Russia and Ukraine, um, which is a bit scary because, as we said in our initial article, this accidental spark idea, the fact that when you have so much buildup, so many troops, so much artillery, any one wrong step could lead to an outbreak. I think the chances of that just get higher with this new normal.
Hmm. And because it's not just Ukraine and Russia, it's also the pro-Russian separatists as well. There's that third
That's right.
sort of wild card group. It was interesting when you're talking about in terms of trying to, decipher all of the signals, because that brings us into the second topic of this week's
It's a
podcast, which
great segue,
is,
Clay.
I do my best, which is the bias, information, and noise model of forecasting. This is a recent paper by, and please pardon this pronunciation, Satopää. I probably messed up the umlauts, Salikhov, Tetlock, and Mellers. Um, Apologies for the name mispronunciations, but this is a recent paper that came out this year, trying to break down the components of forecasting and how they impact accuracy. Um, Let me just say before we talk about this that in terms of academic papers, I thought this was one of the best ones that I've read recently. I thought it took a very engaging way of doing like a literature review. I just thought it was well written and a very compelling article. Which is not always the case when it comes to academic literature, especially when you're doing the literature review part of things. That tends to be the worst part. So I just like to shout out good academic writing when you see it. But the main idea of this paper is that a forecast. Let's take a step back. So when someone's trying to create a forecast, they are attempting to parse signals about an event. So let's say that you are trying to predict when the traffic light will turn red. One signal that you could interpret would be um, the pedestrian walkway. If that goes from, the person walking to the hand stopping, you can make a probably a reasonable that is a strong signal that shortly the light is going to turn red for you driving, and that it would therefore be a positive signal. A negative signal for when the light is going to turn red is if it just turned green. Recency of that starting would be a positive signal. This is probably not the best way to break it down. So there are those signals. And when you're trying to make a forecast, you are trying to grab all of those signals and add them up. If it comes up positive, an event is going to happen. If it is negative, the event doesn't happen. But there are more than just signals in the world. There are fake signals. That could be, the amount of pedestrians that are at the crosswalk. That could be a signal that doesn't matter. Maybe um, the amount of cars on the road. You could, in some roads, if there's pressure sensitive, that could impact when a light will change. Not always. So that could be a sort of a useless signal. And forecasters are trying to interpret these signals. So how does this work? So when you interpret a signal, um, you have to determine if it's real or if it's not real, if it's relevant or not relevant. If you classify that correctly, that's a good thing. If you miss a signal, if you sort of take that pedestrian walkway and ignore it, that's noise. Noise is sort of misinterpreting positive signals and sort of fake signals. You can also misprocess a signal. So um, instead of taking something as that makes it more likely, you would say that makes it less likely. And doing that systematically is bias. That's sort of misinterpreting which way a signal should be going. And then there's information, which is just how much you know. If you have perfect information, if you knew everything that was happening, you should have complete omniscience and be able to make a forecast. But most times you have partial information. Um, and so those are like the three components of a forecast: how biased you are, how 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 sort of correctly or incorrectly you sort of place the signals on a spectrum, noise, which is sort of how many relevant signals are you taking in versus how many irrelevant signals are you taking in, and then information, which is just how much stuff is being put into your forecast. And as information rises, you're going to end up having most likely more noise because you'll just sort of filter these signals incorrectly. And the main finding of this paper is that most reduction in terms of forecast inaccuracy, or what makes people better at forecasting, is about 50% reducing noise in terms of being able to determine whether or not a signal is relevant or not. Bias is about a quarter of it, and then information is another quarter of it. And what I found particularly interesting is that bias is really easy to correct in terms of aggregation, um, whereas noise is more complicated to get because that's different processing of information. Now that might be getting a little bit too far into it, but yeah. Do you have anything else to add in terms of the model? Did I do a good job explaining it? I've only read the paper twice, so.
No, you've done a great job, and I think what you said at the outset about the paper being engaging is spot on. I think it was actually very readable. I think the fact they broke it out into, the first paper was maybe 30, 35 pages, and then they have the supplementary material, which is like a separate document. I think that's a great way to do things. Um, yeah, I think what was really interesting, and I mean, it's no spoiler. If you read the paper, you'll see the results were really interesting. So what they did is, they had these, as Clay said, bias, information, noise. They had a couple ways to test it. In the results, they showed the difference in Brier score, sort of between the control groups and the groups that are being tested with these different different variables. And it's exactly what I would have expected, which is kind of cool to see borne out in the actual data. The smallest changes in Brier score came from a control group versus a group that had some training. And I thought that's what I expected, because Clay and I both have not done any formal training like a team in Forest. But I think we've definitely gotten better at forecasting. So I saw training as maybe having the least impact on Brier score, just anecdotally. I think teaming was the second one. The Brier score for individuals versus a team improved a bit more than with the training. And I think, again, borne out in our own experiences, Clay and I have teamed together, for most of our forecasts. When we try and do forecasts separately, I'm sure we're maybe a bit further off. And then lastly was the tracking of forecast performance, and that had the biggest effect on Brier score. And I think that much is borne out in platforms like Metaculus, where that's, I think, one of the biggest value adds of the platform is the tracking, is the public facing aspect of forecasting. So yeah, I mean, I would really recommend that everybody read the paper. We'll probably link it in the description. It's publicly accessible, but yeah, Clay did a great job of explaining it, and it's really fascinating, honestly, for anybody that is interested in forecasting.
What were sort of some of your takeaways based on the takeaways of the paper? Like what did sort of what was like your like next order thought based on this paper? Like for me, um it has to do with being able to fit in more information without increasing noise. There's this idea that basically there's this all the signals in the world technically exist, and it's whether or not you're able to capture them into a forecast. But given that like signals are normally distributed, sort of gathering all of the signals towards the end is going to be difficult and probably really subject to noise. One of my ideas was like how much more information increases forecasts relative to like increase in noise. Like if let's say you have, and I know they use different intervals, but let's say information is on a scale of 0 to 100. If you go from 10 information to 20 information, um, what is the increase in noise that you get there? And really, it's more like going from 80 to 90 information or going from 90 to 95 is probably really when you would see that noise threat increase as you're getting sort of more nitty gritty and trying to sort of get all aspects of the situation in. Um, and that's definitely more so on the aggregation side of things, trying to figure out how you parse that information from everyone. I thought that was sort of like an interesting thing that I was sort of thinking about based on this paper.
Yeah,
Um,
we've been talking about noise reduction for a while. Something I think that makes sense that would fascinate you. I mean, I think sort of similarly, I would love to, because Tetlock and Mellers and all the, authors of this paper posit that um, tracking bias sort of at scale and being able to understand at least directionally and also in terms of magnitude what your biases are and then how to correct against them or at least control for it when you're forecasting is fascinating to me. I'm not aware of my own biases right now. I would love to sort of go through even just our global guessing forecast from day one, go through all of them and try and understand, you know, do I have some tendencies, some trends that I could try and correct against as you do for, future forecasts. Um, I think a lot of what we've heard on the right side of maybe the Global Guessing Weekly podcast is that it really helps to be systematic about your forecasting and to be thoughtful. And I think this paper really hammers that home. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do now that would be really interesting to sort of explore related to, as you said, noise reduction, related to our own personal biases when it comes to forecasting. That would make a very interesting, uh, maybe Metaculus Mondays. I don't know, but an interesting article for sure. Um,
yeah, there's actually that whole point about the super forecasters and like what makes them good. You just brought that up. I thought in this
mhm,
paper it was really interesting when they said forecasting accuracy. It doesn't have to do with the forecast. It has to do with the forecaster's bias, ability of distinguishing signal and noise, and ability to sort of gain information. Right. Good forecasters are ones that have low bias, can reduce noise, and get more information. It's not anything that has to do with a particular forecast, but it has to do with sort of these three components and how they manage them. And that's actually what's predictive of super forecasting and good forecasting accuracy, um, which I think makes it sort of much more trackable in terms of how to get better at forecasting. Have I done better at bias, which means am I getting better at placing signals across the spectrum, which could be very useful if you're reading other people's forecasts and how they're placing signals. If you notice that, well, shoot, out of these 100 people, I consistently am sort of putting these, certain ones in the wrong direction. Well, I have a bias problem. I should work on that. Or, oh, actually, I am good at placing things. I just happen to sort of also add in a lot of things that just don't matter. So I'm a noisy forecaster. I should be a little bit more selective. And maybe for me, because I am good at placing signals, once I determine if they're, but yeah, I'm good at placing signals. I'm bad at picking them out. Maybe triaging the amount of things you're including in your forecast will improve accuracy. Or maybe you're great at noise and bias. You just don't have enough information. Well, that's probably one of the easier ones to fix. But you at least know where you're supposed to be looking.
I'm hoping we can employ some of these, and we'll probably get to this later, but I think, we have an upcoming forecast that we're going to be working on, thinking about. It's an election. I feel like an election is, you know, one of the most best testing grounds for a lot of these new techniques and ways of thinking. There's some forecasts like what's going on in the Donbass and like the Suez Canal, where I feel like there's less potential for noise in those situations. Honestly, I think when you have an election where there's so many vying interests and so many candidates and so many different news sources, I think it's going to be very interesting to try and test out some of these ideas. Um,
Hmm.
I think, yeah, maybe less so the bias, but definitely noise reduction, trying to
Actually,
understand
probably
what's
bias
actually
too.
diagnostic.
Um, yeah, I mean noise. I think during election that's huge. There are signals um, happening hourly.
Yep.
Um, but I do think actually bias will be. Um, Actually, wait, before we get to that, real quick, I
Yeah.
just want your opinion on this paper and many papers all use the same data set, which is using the IARPA geopolitical forecasting data from, I believe, 2011 to 2015.
Yep.
And a lot of papers use the same data set, and it makes sense. This was, tens of millions of dollars poured into doing these forecasting tournaments, and so it's obviously high quality data. Um, and I know that they sort of do sampling of data for other situations that they didn't consider in their sensitivity analysis. Um, but is there something? To what degree is it troubling that a lot of papers on forecasting all use the same data set when reaching its conclusions? Um,
Yeah, no, I think it is just a bit concerning. We both are, you more so than me, but academics, we've written, research papers. I think when you have so many papers, so much like integral research in the forecasting space based on like one basically fulcrum tournament, I think if somebody were to make a legitimate claim about, for instance, like I don't know, incentive issues with a tournament, like we talked about this before, like do certain incentives, do things with bias and noise change within the forecasting environment? If someone made a legitimate claim about that, and all these papers are based on the same set of data, you've got a real problem. So I think just from like a risk perspective, it's probably a bit concerning to have this one tournament be sort of the fulcrum for so much research. That being said, and as you mentioned, tournaments are a great form of data for forecasters. It's very rare that you get that many people doing that many forecasts within a controlled environment. So, like in terms of research, it makes a lot of sense why that'd be the case, especially because forecasting is still so new. There's not a ton of examples similar to this tournament that you can use to do good research. Um, but yeah, no, it is definitely very concerning just how much research is based on that one tournament. Um, and my guess is that as forecasting becomes more socialized, as there's more tournaments, the research will diversify a bit in terms of their sources. But yeah, no, it is a bit concerning. And also, we talked about this before. I'm not sure it really matters, but a lot changed in the world after 2015 as well. So I think the fact that most of this data is pre Donald Trump, pre maybe a more exacerbated demonstration of America's hegemonic decline. I think I don't know, I think there could be issues there as well, um, but yeah, right now we're sort of lacking for other for other data, so we have to deal with what we have.
and then, as before we just got on this topic, we were teasing one of our upcoming forecasts. When we started Global Guessing, we had a whole election mini series to get our feet wet in the forecasting space, and we are preparing to do another election forecast this time in Peru. Um, and we were talking about how noise filtration will be very important, but I also think bias will be important, just given the nature of the election and who is running in it. Andrew, I know you've done a little bit more research into this than me, so why don't you give us a sort of a brief setup of, well, what the upcoming presidential election in Peru is all about?
I mean, so one of the reasons why we were excited about this election to begin with is, I mean, most of the elections that we've looked at, and this is actually pretty eye-opening for us just at a macro level. Um, a lot of elections were, very much pre-decided. It was like it was pretty clear who was going to be the winner. It was pretty clear like what the situation was. This election, I think, I read an article back in March that said nobody was polling over. There's very few people polling over double digits. It was that contested. There were 18 candidates. And there's a lot of market factors riding on this election as well. Peru is the second top producer of copper in the world. Copper is used in a lot of electrical equipment. It's a big market. People invest in it. So the implications for the copper market are going to be massive. There's also, Peru's currency, the sol. When so right now there's two front runners. It's sort of reminiscent, as Clay mentioned. We talked about this offline yesterday of 2016, and the fact that like it's a pretty left wing and a pretty right wing candidate going at it at the top. I think the most recent poll that I saw from Datum International had the left wing candidate at 41% and the other candidate at 26%. And there was some concern about the left-wing candidate nationalizing a lot of their commodity markets and commodity resources just based on his platform. He's come out now and said that won't happen, which is, I think, has stabilized the markets a bit, stabilized Peru's national currency. But there's a lot of really interesting plays from a financial perspective that we might be able to make, and a lot of really big implications geopolitically as well that I'm excited to look forward to.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As I just showed the polling, recent polling. If you're watching this on YouTube, the left wing candidate definitely has a comfortable uh, polling lead right now. But if you add up the amount of blank none and undecided um, in these polls, you're looking at, let's see, that's like 37% undecided or none, 27% undecided none, 32% undecided none in these polls. And so while the left wing candidate has a large lead right now, you have that huge undecided non.
It was
um,
30% earlier, like a month ago. I think there were like
yeah.
30% of people who either were going to put in, like, said that they're going to put in like a blank ballot or didn't know who they're going to vote for. 100%, I agree.
And the question is, does that hold up? Right, the first round of voting had 70% voter turnout in Peru. Um, if people show up in the polls, are they going to stay undecided, or will they pick one of two, and then which way will that break? Clearly, looking at the poll right now, Pedro Castillo, the Free Peru candidate, who is the left wing, is beating out Kiko Fujimori. Did I get that right? Probably not.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Close enough. She is the Popular Force candidate, which is the far right party in Peru. She's the daughter of the former president of Peru from 1990 until I think like 98 or 2000. But she's polling more poorly. The question is there a 2016 US effect where undecideds aren't really undecided and they'll break heavily for the far right candidate, or will we see a more even break when it comes to those people, which would then put Pedro far and ahead the favorite? The polling graph here would therefore indicate that he gets over 60% of the vote. I think sort of that's, if we had a forecast right now, I would say Pedro is clearly the favorite, but I would say there's definitely, it's an outside chance, but I don't think you can count out necessarily the far right candidate, and it'll be really
Not
sort
at
of
all.
interesting to break down all of the factors happening in Peru. Because if you look on the Wikipedia article, which is, take that for what you will, breaking down this election, a lot of the sort of the social, political, economic factors that are motivating this election aren't identical, but they are similar to a lot of the motivating factors in the 2016 U.S. election. Now, people in Peru are different than those in the US, and so they might respond to those factors instead of looking right, looking left. Uh, that's certainly a very distinct possibility, and so that's why all this commentary is staying intentionally vague, is because we haven't fully dug into it. But given the fact that there's three polls total that we're looking at, which is a very small amount, that it'll be very interesting to sort of dig into this question and sort of and get a better understanding of how likely is the chance that the polling is off in a similar way that it was in 2016 in the United States. Um,
And just quickly before we close, I think it'd also be interesting. This is our first South American election that we'll be forecasting. So to look at, potentially later down the line, if there are any trends continentally um, in the way that elections run or the way that, certain populaces look at their different candidates, um, the number of candidates, whatever it may be, I'll be interested to just sort of compare our past elections, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Portugal, and now this one, and to see if there's any similarities, anything interesting. So be cool to watch.
So make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and to our website globalguessing.com so you can get
Yep.
an email notification when that forecast is live and ready for you guys to view. And if you have any commentary or perspective on this in any way, make sure to reach out to us either in the comment section on social
Social
media.
media.
You can get out on our website. We have a contact if you want to send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and gain your perspective. And maybe you'll find a positive signal, or maybe you've just found noise. We'll have to do that filtering ourselves. And on that note, that is the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, episode 10. My name's Clay.
I'm Andrew.
Thank you. And that's a wrap. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.